السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعل أمريكا مطمئنة إلى أنها عادت إلى القيادة وإلى وضع قواعد الطريق لبقية العالم، وقد يكون الهدف من هذا الأمر ما يسمى إشعاع قوة الولايات المتحدة، ولكنه يشير بدلا من ذلك إلى فهم ضعيف للحقائق التي تواجهها. لعل الهوة في علاقات أمريكا مع أوروبا وآسيا كانت تزداد تباعدا قبل دخول بايدن البيت الأبيض، وبالتالي من قبل فترة ترامب التخريبية عمدا أيضا. لماذا إذن تنكر الولايات المتحدة هذا الأمر باستمرار؟ من ناحية بحسب المراقبين بعد 7 عقود من السيادة العالمية هناك حتما بعض الجمود الذي من شأنه أن يعيق أي قوة مهيمنة عن تسجيل التغييرات المهمة في الماضي القريب واستيعابها. ومع ذلك بالنسبة إلى أمريكا هنالك عامل آخر يساعد في تفسير أذنها الصماء، إنه تركيز المؤسسة أو الاستابلشمنت الأوسع على منع الانتخابات الرئاسية لعام 2020 من التحقق أو التثبت من صحة نتائج الانتخابات السابقة، الأمر الذي حجب ملاحظة تغير العالم خارج نوافذهم. هذا ليس منحا تنفرد به أمريكا فقط. من السهل أن نفهم لماذا كان الاتحاد الأوروبي متحيزا للغاية بسبب وصف وزير الخارجية الروسي سيرجي لافروف للاتحاد الأوروبي بأنه شريك غير موثوق به، وهو ما كانت عليه الحال بصراحة. ولعل تقريع موسكو للاتحاد الأوروبي ومقاربته الاستعلائية والبعيدة عن العالم الحقيقي هو جانب، ولكن عدم رغبة أمريكا الاستماع وفهم روسيا والصين واعتماد الصمم الثقافي الذي بات ميزة الغرب اليوم تجاه بعض الدول المؤثرة هو جانب آخر يتطرق إلى مسائل الحرب والسلم. يطيب لنا اليوم أن نستقبل من العاصمة البلجيكية بروكسل الأستاذ ايلايجا ماغنييه مراسل الحرب المخضرم وكبير محللي المخاطر السياسية، الذي يتمتع بخبرة تزيد على 35 عاما في تغطية أخبار أوروبا وأفريقيا وغرب آسيا. أهلا وسهلا بكم إلى حلقة جديدة من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعونا. Elijah Maghniye, veteran war correspondent and senior political risk analyst, as we said, with over 35 years experience covering Europe, Africa and West Asia, joining us from Brussels in Belgium. Welcome to Mina Dakhil from the inside, Elijah.
Thank you for having me.
Pure pleasure to have you always. Why do the US and Western pundits see Iran's role and behavior in the Middle East as malign and dangerous? And how did the US create all the circumstances for Iran to become a formidable, considerable regional power?
Well, actually, Iran needs to make very little effort to become a regional power. It just needs to collect behind all the American mistakes in the Middle East throughout the decades. We saw the Americans invading Afghanistan, and today, after 20 years, the Taliban control 52% of the territory. We saw how the American failed in Iran to impose it to Germany through all the harsh sanctions that were imposed since 1979. After 41 years, the Americans did not achieve anything. We saw how Iran supported a group of Lebanese willing to stop the Israelis from expanding and occupying further territory in Lebanon and stopping the Israelis there. We saw also how the Iranians supported Gaza, the Palestinian who wants to liberate their territory, and they managed to impose deterrence on the Israelis. We also saw the Iranian support in Iraq and making sure that Iraq is not going to fall into the hand of the Americans. and to create a balance in the relationship. And we saw how the Iranians supported the Syrian government to the request of the Syrian president and prevented the failed state in Syria and prevented the control of the Takfiri, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And of course, all that upset the Americans because it prevented them from imposing their hegemony over this part of the world.
That said, is the US-Iran relationship heading for further escalation or on the brink of collision? Or might those concerned be convinced that it is time to sit around the negotiating table?
I don't think the Americans will dare to attack Iran because the Americans taught the Iranians to be self-sufficient, and the Iranians started to become producer of their own weapons and their own industry. And we saw how, following the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, how the Iranians bombed the largest US base in Iraq, and the Americans didn't retaliate, which means that the Iranians are showing a very great capacity. Well, also we saw a very significant move from the Americans to move their operation from the Strait of Hormuz to Yanbu at 2,200 kilometers because they consider already the Strait of Hormuz unsafe. That means there is no other way for the Americans but to sit around the table and negotiate because the sanctions didn't work.
Yet, are the US moves to deploy the Israeli Iron Dome missile interceptor, these systems, which they purchased in 2019, in Eastern European countries and also in Gulf countries where the US Central Command or CENTCOM operates and has established operational military bases, are these moves, Elijah, ultimately and solely defensive?
Well, if they were defensive, then why they put them there? If there is a patriot and they have no malign intentions against Iran. However, even the David Slang and all the Israeli interception missiles, they failed to intercept all the missiles fired from Lebanon. They are failing to intercept the missiles from Gaza. And if 70% of the missiles are intercepted in normal exchange of missiles, well, what about flooding the interception missiles? And then the Israeli system will not be able to cope with all these missiles fired all together, which means the system is not really effective. And this is why I don't think the Americans or the Israelis, and particularly the Gulf country, would dare to think to attack Iran, because Iran has imposed itself as a regional power and showed its capability.
Right. In 2014, ISIS occupied a third of Iraq, and the US refused to deliver already paid-for weapons to Baghdad. Then Iran intervened at the behest of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. A fatwa of the highest religious authority in Iraq, Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Sistani, created the PMUs that Iran armed along with the remaining of the Iraqi security forces to confront ISIS. Does Iran control Iraq today? Elijah, I'm asking you this because you've been on the ground, you talk to high-profile figures, and you talk to the people. And tell us more about the role of Iran in Iraq.
Well, I lived in Iraq for 10 years, and I've been traveling on and off to Iraq every single year. I can tell you Iran doesn't control Iraq. The Iraqis are extremely difficult to be controlled, either by the Americans or by the Iranians. However, there are many things in common between Iran and Iraq. The Americans, people forget that the first prime minister of Iraq was Ayad Allawi, was appointed by the Americans. The second prime minister was appointed, Ibrahim Jafari, by the Americans. Nouri al-Maliki was appointed by the US ambassador, who is today the U.S. ambassador in Iraq, who's today U.S. ambassador in Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. So all these prime ministers were appointed by the Americans.
But they were okayed, they were vetted and okayed by the Iranians, right?
At the first beginning, no. They were okay by the Iranians because the Iranians know that Iraq cannot be a hostile territory against Iran. Mm-hmm. There is a necessity for a balance between the Americans and the Iranians in Iraq. And the Iranians always took into consideration not to appoint or not to support a prime minister that is provocative to the Americans. Right. And that came after the second term of Noor al-Maliki. Now you ask about the PMU. Mm-hmm. The PMU is not like Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are groups within the PMU who are faithful to Iran because there is the same ideology, and Iran support them because they want to be supported by Iran. But there are also other groups supported by the Americans. That's why we can see that the Americans have substantial power in Iraq, and they have not only the Kurds, they have part of the Sunni. We saw at the parliament when the parliament voted for the withdrawal of the US forces that only the Shia and a few Chaldean and Christian voted in favor of the withdrawal. Iran has influence in Iraq enough to make sure that the country is not going to turn its guns against the Iranians, and Iran supports the Iraqi resistance when the Americans wanted ISIS to divide Iraq in three parts in collaboration with some Sunni and the Kurds, when Masoud Barzani called it a Sunni revolution. He didn't call it an ISIS terrorist attack in an attempt to divide the country. He was in support of ISIS. So when Iran moved in, the Americans were saying, well, Iran is going to fail, ISIS is stronger. Exactly the same scenario happened in Syria when they said President Assad is going to fall in a few months. Exactly the same scenario in Iraq when they said the Iranian will not be able to do anything, but by the willpower of the Iraqi, the financial support of the Iranian, mm-hmm. and Iranian military advisor, and Hezbollah that went to Iran under the request of Noor al-Maliki, ISIS was stopped, and the PMU offered more than 11,000 people who died fighting ISIS. It's not only Iranian who stopped ISIS, but also the Iraqis played the major role. But without Iran, yes, Iraq would have been divided.
Sure. Allow us, Elijah, to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to continue to talk about Iraq and the U.S. forces, whether they are going to withdraw or not from the country, but after the break. إذا فاصل قصير ونعود، لا تذهبوا بعيدا. أهلا بكم من جديد. إيلايجا ماغنييه, veteran war correspondent and senior political risk analyst. Welcome back, sir. Well, you believe that the confrontation between the Iraqi resistance and the U.S. forces is expected to turn ugly this year and the coming years, of course, unless Biden orders the total withdrawal and not the redeployment between Syria and Iraq as forces are doing recently. The U.S. was kingmaker in Iraq, Elijah. Do you see its withdrawal inevitable today?
No, I don't think so. I don't think Biden is better than Trump. Perhaps Biden is going to be more wicked than Trump, because Trump at a certain point said, I'm going to pull out from Syria, and he was stopped. And he was planning to leave Iraq and started the negotiation with the Iraqi government. But I think Biden is going to remain, and what he's doing is he's putting some of his forces outside the window to come back through NATO and the increase of forces of NATO, as we learned yesterday, that they will go to 4,500. And as we all know, NATO is controlled mainly by the Americans and other European forces who are just allies of the Americans as they do whatever the Americans want. So no, Biden is not going to pull out, and the Americans are going to suffer casualty in Iraq. They're going to be extremely careful on the way they move, but the Iraqi resistance is determined without any hurry. There is no rush, but it's to harass them throughout the year, this year and next year, until they pull out.
Yet, Elijah, it is important for the West to listen to what the leader of the revolution, Sayyid Ali Khamenei, has said, quoting him, Iran is not in a hurry to conclude the nuclear deal, but wants all sanctions to be lifted. It will not negotiate any additional issues, like, for instance, the missiles program, and it won't abandon its friends and allies with its duty to support them. What makes Iran's refusal to submit to the US and its allies singular and unparalleled in the world, Elijah?
Because the Americans are extremely powerful, but they don't have an equal powerful brain as the military capacity. We saw all their mistakes one after the other. That's why the Iranians are not there to submit to the Americans. They haven't submitted to Trump's harshest sanctions ever. And Trump was waiting by the phone, and he never received a call from Iran. And Iran said, we can survive. And Iran is going to survive. Even if Biden doesn't lift the sanction, which I think he's going to start doing it, because the international community has no alternative but to lift the sanction. Otherwise, Iran will increase its nuclear capability. And when Sayyid Ali Khamenei said, I am not giving up on my allies, these are not Iran allies. They are part of Iran national security. They are partners, and they are really form with Iran one global front against the US hegemony. That's why Iran consider these allies as not provinces of Iran, because they have complete independency, but they're considered as the arm of Iran, and Iran is the arm of these allies. So it's there is a reciprocity here in the relationship.
Why do you reckon that it is unlikely that President Joe Biden would put Syria on his list of priorities?
Because all the US options are bad. Biden can't leave Tanaf, otherwise Syria will regain its prosperity with the commerce between Iraq and Syria. And the Americans can't leave the northeast Syria, Al-Hasaka, Deir ez-Zor, Raqqa, otherwise the Syrian government will regain the control of the oil and the very rich agriculture. So what the Americans are trying to make sure to starve the Syrian population, because they don't have other choices. They can't leave the Kurds to Turkey. They can't go against Turkey, particularly now that they need Turkey in NATO. And they want NATO in Iraq, and they want NATO in Syria, and they want NATO against the Russian that became the enemy number one of the Americans under Joe Biden. So there are no good options. He doesn't want to leave Syria to Russia. And if he leaves or if he stays, both choices, both are bad choices for the Americans.
Right. Biden declared ending U.S. support for offensive operations in Yemen, including by ending relevant arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE and pushing for a ceasefire. How do you read this?
Well, we only heard Biden saying he wants to do that, but we haven't seen the ceasefire on the ground. And everybody is screaming, asking Ansarullah Houthis to stop, and they're calling for a ceasefire because Ansarullah are advancing toward Marib, and because there is a sanction on Ansarullah on oil. They can't have oil. They're paying for the oil 4 and 5 times its original price. while Ma'rib is full of oil. So we didn't hear Biden saying, I'm going to lift the sanctions. The American ships are in the sea, and they are the one creating the blockage on Yemen. Why he doesn't lift all the sanctions? Why he doesn't allow the humanitarian aid? Why he allows Britain to sell for 1.5 billion pound weapon to Saudi Arabia just last week? Canada is continuing selling arms. Everybody is still selling arms to the Saudis. So we hear, it's exactly what Iran is saying.
What about removing Ansarullah from the list of the terrorist organizations?
Well, it doesn't mean anything because he wants to negotiate with them about a ceasefire. Otherwise, he would be in legal trouble. So lifting Ansarullah from the terrorist organization allow a dialogue, but why he's not lifting the sanctions? That is the main point.
Right. To shift gears, Elijah, in January, the EU Parliament called for new sanctions, again, the subject of sanctions, against Russia and Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline over the arrest of Navalny. The resolution, however, is non-binding. Yet, Josep Borrell, the EU High Representative, meeting with Sergei Lavrov, reassured him that Russia was not on a collision course with Brussels, despite the Navalny brouhaha or hassle. How reliable is the EU in terms of partnership with Russia?
Well, actually, the EU and Russia are not enemy. The Americans are trying to make them as such. This is why NATO has been created, and this is why we have NATO here in Brussels. So the base of NATO in Europe, in the heart of Europe, is to make sure that the European will always follow the Americans' policy, even if they try to resist. We see that Russia is supplying gas to Europe, and without the Russian gas, Europe will freeze to death. And there are relationships between Russia and Europe is not considered as an enemy of Russia, notwithstanding the presence of missiles all around Europe that are directed toward Russia. But the Americans want badly Europe to be in a bad terms with Russia and to stop this cooperation, to stop this relationship. Now you're taking us back to the war in Syria and the gas that was supposed to come from Qatar through Syria and Europe to compete with the Russian oil, with the Russian gas, and also the all the problems Europe made in Ukraine, again to stop the Russian gas flowing to Europe. So there is a constant attempt from the Americans to spoil the relationship between the European and the Russian. And if Russia falls into that trap, then it is the US who is making the whole game.
Right, Elijah Maghnieye, veteran war correspondent and senior political risk analyst. Thank you very much, Elijah, for your astronomically strident insights. Bless you and be safe.
Thank you.
Always welcome. والشكر لكم مشاهدينا الكرام على طيب المتابعة. للتفاعل أكثر تابعونا على صفحات السوشيال ميديا، وحتى نلتقي من كل فريق عمل من الداخل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.